What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Hey guys, before we get into the episode, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Paragons of Earth, the exciting new superhero comic I'm working on with Thomas DJ and Eric Johns. For this comic, we've unearthed a number of obscure and forgotten Golden Age superheroes, plucked them from the depths of the public domain, and completely redesigned and reinvented them for the modern day. It's an exciting cast of characters, and we're throwing them up against the threat of a Lovecraftian apocalypse. It's got action, it's got drama, it's got alternate dimensions and alien worlds, and it's even got a giant shark in a Hawaiian shirt. What else could you want? But in order to make this comic a reality, we need your help. The comic is crowdfunding now, and you can help support it by going to crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. That's crowdfunder without the e.com/paragonscomic. You'll be able to find that link in the show notes, so please double check if you didn't quite get it. Please help make this comic a reality. We are counting on your support. And now, on with the show.
Ignoring what he's done in the past. Blindly, stupidly disregarding the entire graveyards he's filled. The thousands who have suffered. The friends he's crippled. You know, I thought I'd be the last person you'd ever let him hurt. If it had been you that he'd beat to a bloody pulp, if he had taken you from this world, I would have done nothing but search the planet for this pathetic pile of evil death-worshipping garbage. And send him off to hell!
You don't understand. I don't think you've ever understood.
What? What, your moral code just won't allow for that? It's too hard to cross that line?
No! God Almighty, no! It'd be too damned easy. All I've ever wanted to do is kill him. A day doesn't go by when I don't think about subjecting him to every horrendous torture he's dealt out to others, and then end him.
Aw, so you do think about me.
But if I do that, if I allow myself to go down into that place, I'll never come back.
Why? I'm not talking about killing Penguin or Scarecrow or Dent. I'm talking about him. Just him. And doing it because he took me away from you.
I can't. I'm sorry.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I'm welcoming a new guest, and that's Colton Petrey. Colton, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Well, thanks for coming on. I was really glad that you sent me an email and that you wanted to talk about this movie, Under the Red Hood. So we're going to get into that eventually. But before we get to that, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am Colton Petrey. As you said, I run a podcast called Just Dumb Enough, and that is all, dispelling misconceptions with experts about lifestyles and hobbies and careers and concepts in general. And it's just a fun time to never really know what the next episode's going to be.
Very cool. How did you get started with that as the focus of your show?
I was working a job where I was listening to like 12 hours of podcast a day, which is a ton. But I found that I loved the host, but hated hearing the same topic over and over. And so I'm like, I need to break free from only psychology shows or only news shows or only whatever it was. And so I got into the weirder stuff, and I was like, I'd really love to learn about something different every episode, like wildly different, but with the same people. And so I just, after 3 years of not hearing it, I was like, all right, I guess I'll start the show then.
Okay, cool. How long have you been doing it?
I just passed my 2-year mark, so a
Okay,
little bit.
well, good. Congratulations. So was that a pandemic era show when you started up?
Yeah, it was just about the last third of 2021. So I was like, well, what better time than to pick it up
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, we've been talking on a previous episode about a lot of people starting up podcasts during that time, and a lot of them fizzling out after COVID ended. But it's good that some of them are sticking around.
Yeah, I mean, it's always like the statistic is very short on how many people stick around in podcasting. It's like 10
Hmm.
episodes. So
Yeah,
if
if
you're
you make it
past
to
that,
10
like,
episodes, yeah,
yeah, we're veterans at this point. So
yeah.
it's weird, but it gave us the time for a lot of people to experiment and see if it was
Mhm.
for them.
Right, yeah. I mean, I definitely had that too. I've had podcasts in the past that made it to 10 episodes or like just a little bit past and they kind of fizzled out. So this one's going strong though. This is the 174th episode we're recording right now, I think. So we're
Very
getting
nice. Yeah.
nice clip going, yeah.
Yeah, you were
Um
just ahead of me. I think I just did 166.
okay, cool. Very nice. Yeah, we started a little bit before you, but we originally started off as bi-weekly. And then during the pandemic, that's when we moved to a weekly format.
Yeah, I hit a period of time where I was the featured education show on Podbean, and so I was like, well, I need to take advantage of this momentum, and I went
Mhm.
semi-weekly, so I was doing 2 a week, and it is a rough schedule.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why we get these recorded so far in advance now, because I just like we're recording this now in beginning of November. This isn't be coming out until December. So I go through phases when I know I'm going to have downtime to just schedule a bunch of guests, try and get as much content packed away as possible. Whereas before with my old co-host, before he passed, we were doing it week by week, and it was tough. It was tough to always meet that schedule sometimes.
Yeah, you have definitely made the very wise choice.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a topic focused show, right? We talk about superhero movies. So, what is your history with superheroes?
So, I think just because of the nature of like how I grew up, right? I had very busy parents. So I was unintentionally isolated from superhero culture at large for like,
Mhm.
man, I don't know, until I was probably 10. So, at like 5, I was just kind of getting into whatever movies were around the house.
Mhm.
Like, oh, this one showed up, so it must be a movie I can watch because I've got no supervision. And so at age 5, my 2 favorite movies are like Disney's Hercules and Starship Troopers, which are wide gaps and also probably very concerning for my family.
I don't know, with the anti-fascist message of Starship Troopers, it might be good to start you off early on that.
Yeah, they were just like, hey, that's a super hard R movie. Are we okay with the 5-year-old watching this? And they're like, look, it's his favorite movie. He's already seen it 10 times. I can't can't take it away now.
Yeah.
But
Kids of that generation, like the 80s, 90s generation, we were not so big on parental supervision in those days. I remember when I used to spend summers in Florida with my grandparents, and there was a free trolley that would go to the library. And so my sister and I, we'd take the free trolley, we'd go to the library, we'd go and we'd check out VHS tapes, and just like, no supervision. My grandparents didn't care what we were watching. So we just go and like, I think I saw RoboCop that way. I saw Alien 3 that way. Species was one I rented when way too young.
nice. Yeah, mine was like, once they figured out I was watching that, they're like, all right, well, let's just throw sci-fi movies at them and see what sticks.
Mm-hmm.
And that, like, is hit or miss. Because they're also like, oh, anything animated. And so I ended up
Yes.
like loving movies where it's John Carpenter's The Thing, which is a nightmare show for a kid to watch. And also like, oh, well, it's animated, it must be fine. So they pitch like Princess Mononoke, which is also
Mm-hmm.
another like R movie.
I mean, that's not as bad as some of the anime you could have watched at that age.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I dodged some bullets, but they were just like, there was no filter. They were just throwing things at me and see what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, like Spider-Man came out. And
Mm-hmm.
that was my intro to the superhero world. and I loved it. I'm like, oh my God, everything about this is fantastic. Like the plot, the structure, the way everything works, like this is incredible. I love it. And now I've spent, the next decades after that just like buried in superhero culture.
Mhm. So are you more of a, so obviously the movies was kind of your gateway into it. Are you still more focused on like the mass media side of things, like the movies, the TV shows, or have you also branched into the comics as well?
Oh, I got very deep into the comic game because at one point, you just run out of content. And so I'm like, well,
Hmm.
I've seen all the movies that are out, especially early 2000s. There wasn't a lot. So I'm
Yeah.
like, all right, I've burned through all of them. Now I guess I have to start reading. And I
Hmm.
would get into them, and I've always loved, like, probably, I guess, a little more off the beaten path. Like, I'm not a Superman fan. I don't particularly like Batman in general,
Hmm.
but I like some of the ancillary characters, side characters. But I'm like, oh, Red Hood, amazing. Green
Hmm.
Arrow, amazing. Like, I tend to go off a little weird.
Hmm. No, I get that. I've definitely gone through periods of that myself too. And yeah, I get you completely on the the content dearth that we had back in those days, because I came in the early '90s with Batman the animated series and the X-Men cartoon, and once we got to the Batman was every day that first season, but X-Men was only week to week, and then when you got to the end of the season, it's like, okay, it's summer now. What am I gonna do? Because we didn't have DVDs back then either.
Yeah, and I guess that's the weird, like, pickup in trying to go backwards into content, in the 2000s, right? Where I got into it, I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, I want to watch the old stuff. Well, the easiest stuff to get your hands on was like, what's currently running?
Yeah.
And so I got into Batman Beyond before I
Hmm.
got into Batman the Animated Series. So that, like, now that's my favorite Batman is Terry
Hmm.
McGinnis. And that's, like, also a weird choice for most people.
No, it is, but yeah, I totally get that. It's like for me, my for an entire generation of people now, Miles Morales is their Spider-Man, right? He's the one that they saw in the first movie. They saw, Into the Spider-Verse. That's the one they read in the comics. So for a lot of people, he's their first Spider-Man. I mean, for me, my Green Lantern is always going to be Kyle Rayner, not Hal Jordan. And so yeah, I think that's a really cool thing about a lot of this content now is, especially now, because I've spent a lot of time in the fan communities and like the fan fiction scene. And when I started off in the early 2000s, people were writing about characters that they grew up reading. So they were writing about the X-Men or Spider-Man or the Avengers. And then as I got older in that scene and I saw new people coming in, like they were starting to want to write about characters like Ms. Marvel or Miles Morales. They weren't interested in writing about the old characters. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how the tastes change and evolve and what characters people gravitate to or what versions of characters they gravitate to over time.
Yeah, well, and even as like the culture has spread out, like superhero culture
Mm-hmm.
has become very large in Japan. And so then you
Mm-hmm.
get like the rise of My Hero as a whole superhero genre of anime.
Right.
You're like, this is an enormous thing that just cropped up.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Yeah.
you listen to those authors and they're like, oh, it's entirely inspired by American comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and you can totally see that influence too. I mean, and a lot of the tokusatsu stuff in general came from the fact that Toei entered a deal with Marvel and they started doing Spider-Man show, and basically the deal was you can do anything you want with the character. You don't have to stick to the comics. So all they kept was the name and the costume, and they changed everything else. And that really kind of like kickstarted the whole tokusatsu thing. A lot of the tropes we would later get in things like Power Rangers started off because of Spider. They were doing a Japanese Spider-Man.
Yeah, certainly. And it's like it's wonderful. I mean, seeing it
Mhm.
expand, have never been happier with the content.
Oh yeah, same here. Absolutely. So that's a good transition into the next topic, and that is what kind of stuff are you interested in lately? It doesn't necessarily have to be superhero movie related, but what's kind of grabbing your attention these days?
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten really into, and it's still in the superhero genre. It just happens to be right now, which is Harley Quinn doing that show. My Adventures with Superman came out, which is like a very interesting anime take on
Hmm.
Superman in the early years. Um, the Spider-Man 2 game just dropped, which has been consuming some of my attention. Like, so I have oddly been wrapped up in superhero stuff just at the right time for this interview.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah.
like I'm all over the place.
I am too, yeah. But man, My Adventures with Superman that was a show that just blew me away at how good it was. And also, Superman and Lois too, another Superman TV show. It's just been and the stuff they're doing. It's a good time if you're a Superman fan, basically these days. But for my thing, I've been actually very busy working on my own comic book, so I haven't had a lot of time to consume as much content. But when I do have a chance to, I have been watching Loki. At the time of this recording, I just watched episode 4, so I'm one episode behind. Well, I think did episode 5. Episode 5 came out this week, so I'm one episode behind right now. But yeah, that's another show that has been really entertaining to watch. And that's basically where I am. I just not having a lot of time, so it's just been consuming stuff either for this show or working on other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I haven't watched any of season 2 Loki yet. But that's because I know myself and I'm going to burn through that show just like I did with season 1. So I'm like, I'm going to go ahead and wait. I'm going to get rid of all this other stuff I got to finish up, and then I'll just burn through Loki.
Nice. Yeah. But anyway, like we mentioned earlier on, today we're going to be talking about an animated film, Batman Under the Red Hood. This is in kind of a period of time when DC's animated output was mostly focused on doing adaptations of different comic book stories, and they're still doing that to a small extent, but they were a lot more focused on that as kind of like their strategy, whereas now they're a little bit more focused on doing kind of like universe type things. And this was interesting because usually they don't make movies about stuff in the comics that's so soon after the release. Like this came out, before arguably more seminal or more well-known stories like Long Halloween or Hush or anything like that. So it was an interesting choice to do this one, and it's got a pretty good cast, right? We got Bruce Greenwood as Batman, Jensen Ackles as Red Hood, John DiMaggio as the Joker, Neil Patrick Harris as Nightwing, and Jason Isaacs as Ra's al Ghul, and Wade Williams as the Black Mask, and Jim Piddock as Alfred Pennyworth. And this is one of those animated movies that if you ask most Batman fans what their favorite Batman animated movie is, I think you'll usually get a few answers. Obviously, Mask of the Phantasm, I think, would definitely be up there, but you also get people say Dark Knight Returns, and Under the Red Hood is another one that is frequently mentioned as like one of the favorites. Same with like Year One. So this has gotten very, very well received. This has been very well received over the years. So what's kind of your history with this movie and the comic it's based on, for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, so again, like a lot of the stuff, the early death of Jason Todd and the whole death in the family arc, right? Like was before my time. Just, with them doing the call-in votes and like, will he die? Will he survive? One dude cheats, unintentionally makes one of the best Bat family members, like a whole wild series of stuff that happens. And I was shown this movie just on a whim by a friend. I had no idea it was coming around. It's a direct-to-video movie. So they're like, it's not getting any screen time, but it's out there. And so my buddy was like, hey, I picked up this brand new movie. Let's watch it. And it was like rapidly, this is my favorite character of all time. Like, I love Red Hood, the way Jason Todd like plays out. It's fantastic. I had no idea who Jensen Ackles was at the time, and he did just an amazing job. And I think that is in part because he is also like a huge fan of the character pre the movie. And so he's like, I have got to have this role. I would love to see it in live action. This is so great. And that, I think, like you said, it's in people's top 3 pretty regularly. And that shows up when I was looking, rewatching the movie, because this was a good excuse to rewatch the movie. And I was looking at online reviews, and I didn't know it has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Oh, wow.
I was like, that's actually extraordinarily unusual, especially for like an animated Batman movie that never went to cinema.
Right.
And, I don't know that it's perfect, but it's really good.
It is, yeah, it's very, very good. In fact, did you ever read I'm assuming by now that you've read the comic it was based on, right?
Oh yeah, I've went back and binged everything now, but I had
Okay.
no idea anything about Red Hood or Jason Todd as Robin. Like, again, Batman wasn't really my thing
Hmm.
until this movie, and then I was like, oh, I'm gonna figure out everything about this.
Yeah. Yeah, Jason Todd as a character has had an interesting evolution because, I'm sure you probably know this history now since you're a fan of the character, but for anyone who doesn't know, like, what happened was back in the 80s, they had, Dick Grayson he was still Robin, but he had kind of like left the Batman books. He was leading the Teen Titans, and the Batman writers are kind of like, well, we want to have a Robin character, so they introduced Jason Todd, and at first he had the exact same origin story as Dick Grayson. He was also a circus kid who watched his parents, die, and then he ends up hooking up with Batman. Um, Although he had red hair initially, so that was like the big difference from them. And then after Crisis on Infinite Earths, when they were kind of like retooling stuff in the DC universe, they had decided that to make Jason, to differentiate him a lot more from Dick. So they had gotten rid of the circus origin background. Now he was a kid from Crime Alley whose mother was gone, whose father was like mixed up with criminal elements, and he ends up meeting Batman because he's trying to steal the tires off the Batmobile.
Yeah,
And Batman sees something in him. He sees this spark, and he decides to take him under his wing and train him. And he wasn't very popular as Robin, right? He was very different from Dick Grayson, whereas Dick Grayson, when he was Robin, was much more, happy-go-lucky, much more conciliatory to Batman. Jason was, much more rebellious, much more antagonistic, and they'd gotten to the point where they were wondering about what to do with Jason Todd, and they decided, well, let's have the readers decide if they want him to live or die. And so there was this number you could call. It was like a 1-900 number or something like that. If you wanted him to live, you called one number. If you wanted him to die, you called the other number. And now I think they're actually going to be doing an animated movie or something which shows like the version where he survived. And when I was a kid, like my first introduction to Jason was actually through just a random comic I picked up at like an antique store, and it was a Batman and Robin comic, and they were fighting Two-Face, and I remember reading that comic, and he's calling Robin Jason. I'm like, Jason? Who the hell is Jason? Like because this is before internet, so I had no idea what was going on, and it wasn't until much later that I learned the backstory of the character and then about his death and everything like that. And he had basically kind of become one of these untouchable characters in comics where you're not, there's been several characters that you are not supposed to resurrect in comics. You are not supposed to bring back Uncle Ben. You are not supposed to bring back Jason Todd. You were not supposed to bring back Bucky. You were not supposed to bring back Jor-El. And sure enough, all those characters except for Uncle Ben have come back now. And when they had first started teasing the idea of bringing back Jason Todd in the Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee Hush storyline, where at one point in the story, there's this reveal that the villain Hush is actually Jason Todd. And it turned out to be a red herring. It wasn't actually Jason Todd. It was just Clayface masquerading as him. But then there was such a positive reaction to that they decided, well, let's do it for real. And so they had brought him back, and there were different stories about how he came back, right? At some point at first it was because of the stuff with the Infinite Crisis storyline going on and Superboy Prime punching the walls of reality. Comics, folks. That's all I can say about that. But then what they kind of settled on, and I'm not sure which one is considered like the canon explanation, but is kind of what they used in this story, where Ra's al Ghul had resurrected Jason Todd using the Lazarus Pit, which is such a much cleaner version of the story. And I thought that, and at first I was pretty much against the idea of bringing him back. I was also against the idea of bringing back Bucky too, for that matter. but it's proof that if the story's good enough, it can get past those initial reservations. Because now I think, looking back on it now, I'm just like, oh wait, no, this was actually a good move. They've actually improved a lot on the character by bringing him back. Same thing with Bucky and the Winter Soldier storyline.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and there is some fantastic comics. If people, watch this movie and you're like, wow, I'd love to know what happened in between this that made, Jason Todd the Red Hood he is. Recent comic runs like Red Hood Outlaws has expanded into some of that, where they're like, oh, here was the years between Resurrection and showing back up in Gotham, and here's the years after all of that too.
Yeah.
So they've done a fantastic job fleshing out that character, like for sure.
Yeah. And I think one of the strengths of this movie, too, is that they got the same writer who wrote the comic book story to write the screenplay of it. Judd Winnick did both the Under the Red Hood storyline in the comics, and he also wrote this adaptation. So let's just dive into it. What were some things that really kind of jump out at you with this movie?
I think a lot of this movie is like you have to justify the side you pick, right? Because you start out and yes, admittedly, like Red Hood shows up in his first scene of the movie and he has just admitted to killing every lieutenant of every drug dealer in the city in 2 hours. And you're like, and decapitating them. And you're like, okay, so he's absolutely psychotic. But then they kind of introduce him as like the foil to Batman as like, what if he's just a little villainous? What if he is cleaning up the streets? Like they address crime rates are down. Drugs aren't being dealt to kids. There are fewer problems in Gotham and also less criminals because he's murdering them. And you have to be like, well, is he right? Because he's getting better results arguably than Batman ever has. Or is he wrong because of the way he's doing it? And that kind of feeds like the old Batman line about, if you kill a killer, the number of killers stays the same. With a Jason Todd retort that is, what if I do more than one? And you're like, then the number's going down, right? Like, and that's kind of the way you have to watch this movie is you're like, man, is he correct? Or is this too far? And what gives Batman the authority to stop him? Like, is his seniority in Gotham the thing that allows him to stop other vigilantes? So there's a lot of that really like played into the movie for me and I thoroughly enjoyed. And just seeing like presenting an intelligent villain or foil that plans further than Batman does.
Yeah, I think that the ideas it plays with in this movie, and I think, like you said, the whole idea of he's getting better results and what is Batman's authority really? Because when you think about it, because these stories they crop up from time to time in movies and TV show and comics, and you're always kind of positioned as being on Batman's side just by virtue of him being the protagonist. But it does raise the question. Well, it's like, well, who the fuck died and made you the Bat King? So it does raise that question of like, why are you the one who gets to choose to who does and does not get to be a vigilante, right? Why is it that they have to be anointed by Bruce Wayne in order to be legitimate in Gotham? So that's a good question. I mean, there is that whole idea of should Batman kill, which is a debate that you see all the time in fandom. And honestly, I'm kind of tired of that debate. It just gets kind of old. But presenting it this way in the story with a character like Red Hood, who exemplifies Batman's failure, I think is a very good way to have that debate without retreading the same old tired arguments that we've heard again and again and again over the years.
Yeah, because you're never going to stop hearing that argument, unfortunately. Because again, like, I feel like we have covered every answer possible.
Yes,
but it's still just, it keeps coming up. And as a fan in the general fandom, like, we're just going to hear it forever. That just is how it is. But it's very interesting because most Batman stories is like, he figures out their plot and then stops plot. And I'm like, yeah, okay, good work. Like, even though there's some subtle misdirection and it has a big reveal at the end, like, it's very straightforward. And then you get into Under the Red Hood. And like you said, Batman is the title character. Like, it's a Batman movie. So, like, you're supposed to be on his side. But the movie spends, I don't know, a third of its time on Batman, a third of its time on Red Hood, and the other third, like, watching the scenes of the city. Which is very interesting because it's not like an over-the-shoulder shot the whole time. You're not just hanging out with Batman for the movie.
Yeah.
And
I think it
seeing
also...
him...
Sorry, go ahead.
Seeing him get upstaged, like, at every single point of this movie is really almost shocking to the system. Like, it's a huge change to just be like, wow, he's always one step ahead. That's weird because Batman's always one step ahead.
Well, I think it goes to show, it's that whole idea of like, the student becomes the master type of thing where, Jason learned everything. Bruce taught Jason everything he knows, but, Jason didn't only learn from Bruce. He then went out into the world and he learned other stuff too. And I think that's a good way of kind of, I do like it when they try and find different ways to expand on these sidekick characters, right? Like you've got Jason, obviously, who went out into the world as the Red Hood and worked as a mercenary and all this kind of stuff. You've got Dick, who is much more ingratiated into the superhero world with, his relationships through the Titans and all that. So he's like much more of like, more of a, a public face of Batman in a lot of ways. And you've got, Tim, who is the much more cerebral Robin, who's much more focused on, he's much better at strategy. He's much better at the detective side of things. And then you've got Damian, who's just a straight up psychopath.
Yes, he is certainly that. But it's very interesting because it's almost that argument that people have where it's like, what if Batman had started sooner? Because you're like, he got his trauma very young, but he didn't really start his training until he was like into his adulthood.
Right.
You're like, well, what if he started at 10 when Jason started, or when Dick started, or when everyone else started? You're like, what if we started them younger and with a better teacher? What do they become? And it turns out like they can either become Nightwing or they can become Red Hood, and it's impossible to tell what you're going to get.
And that's one of the things I like. I mean, one of my favorite lines from any Batman media about the explanation for the need for Robin was in Young Justice when I think Wonder Woman was like kind of like scolding Batman for the fact that he's involving a kid in these, and he says like Robin had to stop his parents' killer. Robin had to catch his parents' killer, and Wonder Woman says, why? So he could become like you? And Batman says, no, so he wouldn't become like me. And I thought that's a really good way of, kind of justifying this, concept that really, when you think about it, is pretty fucked up. I mean, Batman's basically training child soldiers.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's an interesting tie in the movie there to Young Justice because Brandon Vietti, the director for Under the Red Hood, is the same one who did Young Justice just afterwards. So you see that same development is carried through a lot of his work where it's like, well, let's look at this with a critical lens. What do you actually get? And you get some of the fantastic things that they've done with Young Justice to like really expand on what a character would be like given realistic circumstances.
Yeah. Now, I think for me, the high point of this movie is you touched on this before, but I totally co-sign with it, like Jensen Ackles. Like, I mean, I'm a huge Supernatural fan. I think I first picked up on it. I think it was like in the third season or so, and then I went back and I binged the whole thing, and I became like a hardcore fan. Loved it all the way through. Watched all 15 seasons. Dug it the whole way through. Even when it had its ups and downs, it still had enough fun moments where it still wanted me to keep watching. And yeah, it's so cool seeing him because I just recently talked about Long Halloween on the Batman by the Numbers podcast. And, it's so cool seeing how Ackles has kind of grown as, an actor in his Batman fandom where he started off doing Red Hood and then now he's voicing Batman in the movies. And obviously I'm sure you've seen the pictures of him doing the Batman cosplay and stuff like that. And you think about his role as Dean on Supernatural, and whether it's in his younger years when he was, kind of like this good son who was kind of like put upon, had like all this, all this trauma tied to him. Like that's exactly like Red Hood. That's exactly Jason Todd's story. He would have been perfect back in the day for that character. Now he's too old for that character, but I think he would also make a really awesome Batman in live action. So, I mean, he's got the look. He can do the gravelly voice. He can do the intensity. He can do the trauma. But he's also got this light side that he does as Dean, where he could do the billionaire playboy thing very easily.
Yeah, certainly, and it's been fantastic. Like seeing his cosplay is so high level that you're like you can't help but know that he is a massive fan,
Mm-hmm.
and like he campaigned so hard to get some of this stuff done, and is part of the reason that we have some of the fandom we have in general.
Mm-hmm.
And Jensen Ackles is just fantastic. Like I said, I'm a huge Supernatural fan as well. I don't think I made it through all of it, but I was a big fan, like getting into it, and he is definitely the high point for me. So it's unsurprising that I would love him in Red Hood and in Supernatural, given the amount of character work that goes into both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In fact, my dream casting at one point was Ackles as Jason Todd and Padalecki as Nightwing. I think bringing that dynamic from Supernatural, seeing them play that out as Red Hood and Nightwing would have been really interesting, and that's something that we've unfortunately missed the boat on now. But once upon a time, and maybe in an alternate universe somewhere, we did get that happen.
Yeah, and it's one of those that makes me very hopeful. When you look at casting for things, I'm like, man, I would love to see, instead of rehashing more and more Batman, like let's give traditional Bruce a break.
Mm-hmm.
And now that we've done the new Flash movie, like let's see Michael Keaton as old Bruce, and I would love to see a Terry McGinnis adaptation. And we already have like some fantastic people like Tanner Buchanan, who plays Robbie Keane on Cobra Kai, has volunteered for like Batman roles. He's like, please, I would love to do this. I'm like, he would make a fantastic Terry McGinnis.
I've thought about this a lot ever since they announced that Michael Keaton was going to be coming back in The Flash, and I had been hoping, because you see him now, he looks like that version. He looks like he's a live action version of that old Bruce Wayne. Like he just perfectly fits the part now, and that was something I was wondering about, like who would be a good Terry McGinnis. I had never thought about that, but now that you mentioned that, it clicks completely into place. That would be a dream project, and I'm pretty sure James Gunn is not listening to this show, but if by some reason he is, please make that happen, because there's no reason you can't have both. We've got the multiverse. We can have, a younger Batman with Damian in The Brave and the Bold. We can have the year 2 Batman with Robert Pattinson, and you can have old Batman with Michael Keaton. It is possible to do all three of them. Audiences will totally accept it. So like, this is something that definitely needs to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those, hey, if anyone influential is listening right now and looking for some help, I will gladly volunteer my assistance in whatever that is, even if I'm just going to get, face painted white and I'm part of the Joker's gang that gets beat up for 3 minutes straight. Like, sign me up. I'll be there, whatever it is.
Yeah. Now, for me, I think one of the biggest missteps of this movie is the casting of John DiMaggio. Like, he's a great voice actor. He's done a lot of really good roles. I thought he was much better in Long Halloween, but he just does not fit the Joker at all. His voice is too deep. He doesn't have like that. And it doesn't have to necessarily be like, a Mark Hamill impersonation, but it should have some more variation in it. I just don't picture him as the Joker, and his voice always takes me out of this movie.
Yeah. It's one of those where every time I see someone take a new adaptation on anything Batman, I'm like, okay, let's consider this Joker to be a standalone. Like, it's supposed to be someone out there's favorite version of the Joker. And I think John DiMaggio, again, like, fantastic voice actor, absolutely capable of it. He does play a very different Joker. And, like, I liked some of the jokes, the way it lands, but he also, and I don't think it's his fault, but he has the biggest cringe of the entire movie to me, which is anytime I am sharing this movie or I'm rewatching it even by myself, and I hear him make the same joke at the end of the movie that he makes at the start of the movie, and it's a bad joke. I'm like, oh man, please make it stop. Because he's like, oh, when I wore that costume, it was more maitre d' than biker fetish or whatever. And I'm like, just please stop. It wasn't good the first time. Please don't say it twice.
Yeah, and that's another thing I think that the movie doesn't do quite as good a job on is establishing that history of the Red Hood. I think they give you enough to really kind of know it, but I don't think it never feels like it quite connects the same way as it did in the comics.
Yeah, and I think that's like the unfortunate truth of this
Mm-hmm.
specific movie is it's only 76 minutes long.
Yeah.
So if you had just given us, a full length or even another 20 minutes on that, make it an hour and a half movie, like we'd have gotten a lot more done. Because otherwise they tried to do it like during chase scenes. They
Mm-hmm.
all end up in like very pivotal memory-based moments. And you're like, that's great for people who don't know it, but it's not a lot of context.
That has been one of my ongoing criticism with a lot of these DC animated movies is the runtime. Like if you just beefed it up just a little bit, I think you could really expand on that story a little bit more. And or even if you had done this like a two-parter, like if you had done a Death in the Family movie and then done Under the Red Hood, I think that would have been another way to do it instead of the weird butchered version of Death in the Family we got with the alternate endings, which I've never been able to see all the way through because HBO Max didn't have them on it. So yeah, I feel like that aspect of it's, and I think my understanding, I could be wrong about this, but when we talked about All-Star Superman, my guest at that time, he had mentioned that the reason that movie was the length it was because it was edited so that it could be fit into these, blocks on Cartoon Network at the time. And this is a much more adult oriented movie, so I'm not sure if it's the same case with this movie, but if it is, that would explain why it's got a short runtime. But even if they added 10 minutes more, I think it would have made a huge difference to help explain some of that stuff. I mean, us as fans, it doesn't really matter. We know we have that context going in, but most people are not going to have that context. And I think that is, that's a misstep.
Yeah, well, and especially given how much content they cover. I mean, Under the Red Hood is a massive arc to
Mm-hmm.
just like jam into an hour worth of stuff.
Yeah.
Because they still have to you have to tell the prequel and the setup and then get into Under the Red Hood. Realistically, you only have an hour of storytelling to cover the entire arc. And I'm like, you just need just a little bit more
Yeah.
room. Like, just squeeze it, whatever it takes, just a little more.
Well, even that's not the biggest offender, right? The Injustice series had 5 years of comics they jammed it into one movie.
Yeah.
But
No,
yeah,
I
if
mean,
they, I think sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's just a lot of that because, and I think that is appealing to the general masses. Like, especially if
Mm-hmm.
you're going to release a straight to TV, DVD, whatever it is, like, you got to kind of keep it punchy. But for the rest of us that are
Mm-hmm.
super fans of this content to start with, I'll sit down and watch a 3-hour movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be a little offended at first that it's 3 hours, but I will enjoy it all the way through.
Yeah. Another thing I really liked about this movie, and I had watched this movie before I read the comic. It wasn't until years later that I read the comic, and my impression of it, just from the basic concept, and before I even saw the movie, was that Red Hood is mad at Batman because Batman didn't save his life, and and then you watch the movie and the scene when he's got Batman there and he's confronting the Joker and he's confronting Batman about the fact the Joker is still alive, and Ackles plays it perfectly. He plays that wounded son thing so well that he pulls from Supernatural, right? And it's not so much that he's angry at Batman; it's that he misses that the chances the opportunities he had to spend more time with him, right? When he says that line, he took me away from you. Like he says that with such hurt in his voice, and as a father, like that hits me every time I hear it now.
Yeah. Well, and that's like that entire scene's delivery is so good, and it's purely from Jensen Ackles. Like
Yeah.
he carries that entire emotional delivery from like when he pulls him up and he says, "You're mad at me, not at you." And he just says like, "I'm not mad at you. I forgave you immediately. It's never been about that." Like, but he dives into it where he says, you know, forget about all the people he's put in graveyards or all of our friends that he's crippled. Like, just for me, you couldn't get rid of him. Like, there's no redeeming qualities in this person. You couldn't have done that just for me. Not because I died, but because like we couldn't continue what we had. And I'm like, oh man, that is a brutal delivery, and it lands in utter silence in the movie, and that makes you like really hold your breath.
I think that's another failure. I think Bruce Greenwood is a good actor, and he does a serviceable job in here, but I don't feel like he quite gives the Batman side the same emotional delivery to really kind of understand his point of view as you get from Ackles as the Red Hood.
Yeah, it's definitely like Ackles was a class above everyone in that movie, and I don't know if it's the personal passion or if he just has a genuine talent for voice acting that is underappreciated.
Or it might also
But
just be the experience he has playing such a similar character on Supernatural too.
yeah, it could be like he's already in character. He's just leans in a little further. But it would be interesting to see like if that movie was remade and updated, and we got to see just even if they got the permission to use fan favorite Kevin Conroy in like an AI reproduced telling of that story, how different it would be, and if it really like if that's what sold me more on the movie, or if it was like, oh, that wasn't really what was holding me up, but it's interesting to hear a difference.
Yeah, because the Batman side of this, it feels kind of flat throughout. Like I don't really feel like we get the same emotional train ride that he should be going on in this, right? I mean, he goes through the motions, but that's all it really feels like. It doesn't feel like he's got that same emotional connection to all this.
Yeah, and you get most of like honestly the framing and comic relief of this movie comes out of either Alfred or Nightwing
Yeah.
when they say like, Nightwing's being carried off and he goes, "Did he just say thank you?" Like acknowledging how weird that is in character to be like, what is he going through that he just said thank you, because I've been working side by side with him and he never says it.
I think Nightwing, I want to talk about Nightwing too, because I think, again, this is also kind of a missed opportunity because you've got the two sons there, right? You've got the prodigal son in Jason, you've got the good son in Dick, and you don't get any sense of that dichotomy between them. Like, I think the movie is trying to set that up, which is why they have Nightwing in there for so long, but he ultimately doesn't. They don't land that plane as effectively as I wish they could have, which again is a probably a sacrifice of the short runtime.
Yeah, and I think part of it is like it was beyond the story they were trying to tell. Like there's a lot of family aspect in it, but what they did by eliminating Nightwing so quickly was just to say like, look at how dangerous Red Hood is. Like we just showed you Batman and Nightwing working together, and Nightwing is immediately out of commission within the first 10 minutes of his appearance in the movie. Like
Yeah.
that's how quick and dangerous this adversary we've given you is. And it's like, yeah, I'd love to have seen some more of him and even just like more characterization, because Nightwing, it felt really shallow just because we didn't see him very long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was all to establish a threat. And then
Yeah.
after that, they're like, we don't have the bandwidth to also get through a Dick story.
And it's a shame because Dick and Jason, they've got such a fraught relationship, which is one of the things I loved about Titans when they went into that with on that show. But Neil Patrick Harris is, he does a great job as Nightwing in the brief time that he is in this movie, and I would have loved to see him and Ackles play off each other a little bit and play a little bit with that idea of, the the brother aspect of their little family dynamic. And it's a shame that we don't get that here. Is one of the regrets I have, especially because Red Hood is your favorite of the Bat family. For me, Nightwing is my favorite of the Bat family. So as a Nightwing fan too, it's also kind of a letdown.
Yeah, and that feels like one of the big missed opportunities that like a longer runtime would have given us,
Mm-hmm.
is how upset and disappointed everyone should have been by the Jason Todd reveal.
Yeah.
And we only really get that, like, Alfred, when he first sees the DNA match, like he drops everything he's holding, which is very, unbecoming of Alfred.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end he says, like, do you want me to remove his costume from the cave?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the most potent line I think that you get out of Batman in the movie is, this changes nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like those two very different attitudes about it. But I would have loved to have seen like Dick Grayson react to, oh my God, that's Jason.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get it at all. Like, he doesn't even know, by the canon of the story, he's not there for any of that reveal. He doesn't even know he was there.
I think the movie kind of takes it for granted that the audience knows that this is going to be that Red Hood is Jason Todd. And I don't think that I think they're just they're not playing up the mystery aspect of that. Like, you compare it to, and I felt like the Arkham Knight game had the same problem, where it didn't really, it just took it for granted that you're going to know that it's obviously going to be Jason Todd under that mask. So when the reveal comes, it's very underwhelming the way it's presented, and the strength of the movie is not necessarily in that unveiling, but you should still, it may not be a surprise to us, but it's supposed to be a surprise to the characters. And I don't feel like it's played up enough as how they react to that.
Yeah, we get like a chair flip and a tray drop,
Mm-hmm.
and that's in the span of 15 seconds, and then it's just, that's it. All right, we're all done.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, Batman has kind of a whole thing where he goes to Raish and he breaks into the palace and he's throwing him around and he's threatening him, and like they tell the dramatic story, but there really is no like, there's no emotion in the reveal.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're like, oh, I'm upset at what is currently happening, but not because it's Jason, just because, like, oh, I should have figured that out.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, why would you know this?
I think the race scene is really cool in that aspect, because it is really interesting in that aspect, I should say, because Ra's seems to have more of an emotional reaction to it than Batman does. Like,
Yes.
one of the things I loved the characterization of Ra's in this movie, right? The fact that it really makes you feel that respect and admiration he has for Batman. And that's something that, kind of got lost in the Nolan films. But, if you watch the animated series, I thought did a good job of handling, and which has always been there in the comics too, is the fact that, Ra's admires Bruce. Ra's wants to work with Bruce. He likes Bruce as a person. He just thinks Bruce is misguided, and it's his job to keep Bruce off his back, or hopefully convince him to take up his mantle, right? That's what he wants to do. And you really get that sense in this movie when he says that, look, I hired the Joker, and I did it because I just thought he would be an annoying distraction for you so that I could go about my business in peace. And I was horrified by what he did. And, hearing that come from Ra's, who believes that humanity needs to be eradicated in large numbers to improve the planet, that's a pretty big deal for him to say, like, I'm mourning the death of this one human because he's your son. And he's like, and it's my fault, and I wanted to make that right. And as misguided as it is, but the fact that he says, like, after that, I avoided you, right? I stayed out of your life. I stayed out of your way because I didn't want to come into conflict with you anymore. I felt I had taken too much from you. I totally bought his rationale. Twisted though it may be, it still made sense to me.
Oh yeah, I absolutely loved Ra's in the movie, because he is just, like you say, he's characterized so well. Is you're like, why is Ra's not being a bigger villain?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, it's because he is an unwitting participant in what happened. Like, he didn't know it was going to go here. He is horrified. He is sorry. This is his apology to just say, like, I'm sorry, I won't. It's almost like an ex that didn't want to break up, where they're like, look, I won't come around anymore. I'm really sorry for what happened. I just, I hope things will be okay in your life. And I tried to set them right as best I could. And you're like, it's so interesting to see that aspect of him versus like, I control a league of assassins and I'm going to murder everyone.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I thought it was so well done with him. The other thing is another thing I like too is, and you'd kind of touched on this before when you're talking about how Jason is being a more effective crime fighter by, it's funny. He basically does the Green Hornet approach. If you ever watch if you're familiar with that character, where the whole idea is like he's posing as a criminal, but it's really to take down bad guys, and that's essentially what Jason is doing here. He is pulling a Green Hornet, and I thought this was such a better execution of that concept than honestly any Green Hornet adaptation we've ever gotten.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it comes out very dark, and that's intentional, right? Given like the entirety of Batman knowledge that anyone has. Like this is a very dark take. Like the setting difference, which I think is much more real to Gotham, to say like, yeah, people are dying left and right, and you see every manner of that inside this movie. People are getting shot, stabbed, blown up, immolated, like there's decapitations and all kinds of stuff where you're like, wow, this is a really aggressive Batman universe. And you're like, yes, and yet it doesn't happen to anyone innocent. Like everyone in this movie that you see it happen to raises the question, is this overkill? Did they deserve it? Is he still wrong? Like it makes you pick a side. And sometimes you look at the sides and you're like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what I thought, like, you can't just mass murder everybody. And then you see it played out and you're like, look, he's out of line, but he's not wrong.
Well, another thing too, it makes me think of is, so there's this idea among, and I can take it back to Japan for a minute here. And over here, for a long time, there was kind of this idea that the police had regarding the Yakuza, where they're like, look, crime is going to exist, so it's better if it's organized than opposed to if it's chaotic. And that was something that a lot of police officers sincerely believed for a very long time here. Which is how the Yakuza was able to get so powerful in the first place. And, things have been turning on that in like the past 10 or 15 years. But I think that's an interesting idea that you look at it in the context of a Batman universe and you see, yeah, Batman stopped the mob. He got rid of a lot. He helped clean up the Gotham Police Department. Things are a lot better than they were before. But now you have psychotic clowns and crime lords in masks and all these different supervillains now that you never had before, right? That whole theme of Batman being a source of inspiration unintentionally for the villains, and that idea of escalation that I thought was done so well in The Dark Knight. Whereas, so Jason knows all that, right? He lived that firsthand. He saw what the results of that is you get beaten to death with a crowbar while a psychopath giggles over you. And he's trying to find a different way. And it seems to be working.
Yeah, and it really is like you traded criminals for villains. And that just means like they need a theater, a stage to perform on.
Right.
And still have the same goals. So yeah, there's a little less chaos. It's a little more predictable, but it's also way more dramatic. Like the people you have created might not be as widespread as before, but they're way more violent. Like incredibly so. Like they now want to be an icon like you are an icon.
Yeah.
And so when you look back at it, you're like, okay, he's definitely killing people. But they openly acknowledge there's no more drugs in schools, parks, the streets. Like, the drug deals that are happening in a very sanctioned area. So do you want your criminals back? Or do you want kind of a villain who has an entire rule set of morals that he operates by? Like, which is truly worse?
and the killing people thing, right? It's not like a Punisher situation where he's just, killing anybody who breaks the law, right? He's doing it in a controlled, methodical, strategic way. He's killing the people who, as a warning to others, and he's saying like, look, you're going to fall in line now, right? And if anyone steps out of line, then they suffer the consequences. So, he's not, a stone cold psychopath. He's doing this with an actual plan in mind, and that's something Batman never had a plan. Right? He's in all the time. As much as we talk about, Batman's strategic mind and how he's always thinking 10 steps ahead of everybody. He's playing 3D chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Yeah, in an individual battle, maybe, but over the long term, his plan to fight crime is just basically to beat it up, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, and you see that, like, when played against him, his plans quickly fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, you could give Batman every advantage you want, but it still goes exactly the way that, Jason wants it to go in the movie.
Yeah.
Like, he sets up an entire room of criminals, knowing that Batman's going to chase them down. And when he does chase them down, he'll total the vehicle. And when the vehicle is totaled, a Mazo pops out.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to murder a Mazo. And that means you need to question the criminals. And then he kills the criminals. And every single step is already pre-thought. He's like, I made a grand web of design, and you are just playing into it. Because at every point from the start of the movie to the end of the movie, it's just Jason Todd directing.
Yeah.
He is in charge of literally every step.
Now, one of the downsides to that too is they set up this very interesting ethical debate between Bruce and Jason that never gets resolved, right? As soon as we get into the fact that he is Jason and Bruce knows that for sure, then it becomes all about killing the Joker and, getting revenge or getting justice for what the Joker did to Jason. And it becomes all about the father-son dynamic, which again is totally interesting. That's the best scene in the movie. But I also feel like now that we're talking about it, it does feel like the core, the plot that they were working at as kind of a springboard has just been kind of dropped, right? This whole idea about this, because what happens now? Is Red Hood still in control of these gangs? Because he hasn't been stopped. He's still out there. Bruce hasn't convinced him of another way. So and this is stuff that, could have been picked up in a sequel, but we never got a sequel to that. So that's kind of a disappointment, which of this movie I felt.
Well, I think there's 2 acts to this whole movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the first act, it is the setup. You have a random villain, which just happens to be Jason Todd.
Mm-hmm.
And until the reveal, the movie is, hey, Batman, come chase me.
Yeah.
Right? You can try to stop me. You can try and do whatever you want, but you can't. And I'm going to routinely not kill you, just so that you know I have the upper hand, which is going to drive you insane. And then once the reveal happens, it becomes will Batman help Jason? Mm-hmm. And Jason's point of view is, you're going to help me, and there's nothing you can do about it. Mm-hmm. At every step, you're going to do what I want you to do, even if you don't want that. You're going to be on my side. So when the fearsome hand of 4, the originals, right, for this movie that have never existed before or after, show up, Jason Todd is baiting the fight. Mm-hmm. And they said wow, I really thought you'd put up more of a fight. And he said, no, I'm just waiting. I'm bait. I'm a delay. And then Batman shows up, and when he doesn't finish the job fast enough, Jason kills a guy. Mm-hmm. And he says, that's on you. If you were faster, if you were better, if you worked like me, I wouldn't have killed that guy. Mm-hmm. And then the next one, it's oh, I orchestrated all these things that got the Joker released. I'm going to let the criminals be lit on fire. Mm-hmm. You can either come get me, or you can stop them from burning to death. Mm-hmm. But if you stop them, I'm getting away. And so when he does, he stops the fire, he picks up the Joker, he unwillingly gives Jason the escape from the bridge that he needs. Because otherwise it's just Jason and the Joker on a bridge surrounded by cops.
Right.
But when Batman hooks the Joker with an aerial crane, essentially, and then Jason jumps onto the Joker, he gives him the escape into the underwater that he wanted the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, you're still helping me. Every step of this, you're going to assist me, even if you don't want to. And if you do, it's easier for me. So what do you pick? Like, and it's a weird divide, but I can see why it played out that way.
Yeah. My whole thing is, though, I think they set it up too well, though, because then you have that whole idea there that it's like, well, Jason hasn't been stopped. He's still in control of all these gangs. What's Bruce going to do now? So they almost set him up too well because the movie doesn't have a plan for that part of it.
Yeah. Well, and that happens all the way to the end, even when you're like, okay, I know you're Jason. I'm going to stop you, even if that means, beating the absolute hell out of you. I'm going to stop you. And so you see that fight and you're like, oh man, it was pretty even at the start, but now Batman has the upper hand. He's really kind of knocking him around. He throws him through a building and then he beats him up in a bathroom and he kicks him through a wall. And you're like, yeah, but where does that fight end?
Mm-hmm.
It ends not in the same building, but in the exact same room that Jason had intentionally already had a captive Joker and a series of bombs.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, even at the end, when you're finally seeing him like, oh, he's stopping the Red Hood. This is the climax of the decision he had to make. Like, you're still playing on his terms.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing was just like more bait. Like, he's just chumming the waters. And no matter which direction you swim in, like, it's all a cage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good note to end on. Was there anything else you wanted to mention about Under the Red Hood?
No, I mean, honestly, the biggest thing I would say about Under the Red Hood is like a deep plea from every corner of my heart. Like, please watch it. If you haven't watched it, it's such a good movie, even if you don't like animated movies. And, as we said, it's unfortunately too short, but also if it's not your thing, like, it's pretty short. So just give it a shot.
Yeah.
That would be my takeaway on the whole movie.
Yeah, and I think it does a good job, especially with Jason and with Raish, like we said. Even though I don't like the voice acting of the Joker, I think the story itself does a good job of presenting the fact that the Joker is somebody that everybody is afraid of, right? Even the villains don't want to deal with him. So I thought that was also something that was done pretty well. But really, the standout of it for me is and has always been Jensen Ackles. Like, he just brings so much emotion to that performance, and he sells it so well. Like, I was not a fan of the Red Hood concept to begin with, so when I saw this movie, his performance alone completely turned me around on that concept, and it made me say, like, okay, well, now I want to see it, because my impression again was that it was just going to be, oh, he's angry that he's angry at Batman, so now he's going to be like a Punisher type, and it's so much more complex than that, and I'm so glad that they went that direction instead.
Yeah. If this movie is in an elevated position, Jensen Ackles is the pedestal that holds it up.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. All right, Colton. Well, thanks so much for coming on and talking. It's fun discussion about the different layers to this movie. So why don't you tell people where they can find your stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, Just Dumb Enough Podcast. You can find it anywhere podcasts are played and some other places as well. But, if you want to check it out, I always tell people, like, just pick a random episode that sounds interesting to you. Like, maybe bees isn't your thing, but a psychic medium is, or, twisted psychology or lightsaber combat. Like, we have all of it. So I say just pick one you like and just start there. I'll be more than happy if you just spend a couple minutes listening to me.
Okay, cool. Well, again, thanks for coming on. And please make sure to check out that show. We'll have links to that in the show notes. As for us, superherocine-philes.com is the website, Super Cinema Pod on Instagram and Blue Sky. Technically also on Twitter, although now that Elon Musk is a psychopath, I don't spend a lot of time over there. So mostly you'll find me on Blue Sky these days. And don't forget to, we have the Patreon page, patreon.com/superherocine-philes. If you want to donate, get access to the episodes in advance and other fun stuff like that. Plus, I've got my comic book that is still crowdfunding, Paragons of Earth. I'm working on it with Thomas DJ, who is co-writing it with me. Eric Johns, who is the penciler, he also used to do work on the Razor comics back in the 90s. And I'm doing everything else. I'm doing the coloring, the writing, the inking, the lettering. So please check us out. It is crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. That is crowdfunder without the e.com/paragonscomic. And links to that will also be in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine, with the support of Zencastr. The show is created by myself and the late great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. You can also support us by visiting crowdfunder.com/paragonscomic. That's crowdfunder with no e.com/paragonscomic, and help support my superhero comic book, Paragons of Earth. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.